My name is Neil Hodgkinson. I'm a program manager in the Office 365 CAT CXP team, which I know Microsoft's the acronym center of the world. So that's Customer Advisory Team, Customer Experience Program. So I spend a lot of time working with our field, with our customers, basically retrieving their bugs, retrieving their issues and problems, feature requests, for example, feeding that into the engineering team, and then feeding those no's back to the field and the customers. So it's a bit of an interesting position. I love it. It's great. Getting beaten up from both sides is an interesting place to be. So I'll let Manas introduce himself and carry on with the session.
Thank you, Neil. Hi, everyone. My name is Manas, and I work with Office 365 Escalation Services team. Primarily, if there are issues which you guys report, that's when we start working on it and trying to go out and assist and fix stuff. Work based out of Bangalore, and today, as Neil mentioned, we're going to take you to some of the common scenarios which you can take a look primarily from troubleshooting aspect and fixing the things. Taking a look at session objectives, we are going to look at all of the forensic evidence from SharePoint when problems occur with hybrid. Okay. Discuss the key moving parts that you take a look at whenever you are trying to deploy any of these solutions. And there are some common errors whenever we have spoken to anyone who says my hybrid search, BCS is not working. And that it's not that people tend to do those, but it's like common configuration scenarios which people kind of go out and try to look at an environment from a different angle. So we're going to talk about those. And key takeaways, we're sure that you would be able to go ahead and look at those scenarios and ensure that that's not what is the reason why your hybrid is broken. So before even we get to any of the other things, how many of you have been deploying or have deployed any of the hybrid workloads like business connectivity services or search? Wow, great. So, and I think there are a lot of you who were at our session about business connectivity services and how do we talk to an on-prem data source. However, today, we are going to take a quick look at hybrid infrastructure overview and the deployment statistics. Troubleshooting the hybrid infrastructure, we are going to focus on directory synchronization, trust, and then look at once the infrastructure is ready, how do you configure the actual workload, which could be search, BCS, which we were talking about today. So, like for those of you who are already investing in one of the hybrid workloads, we have each of our applications and we have various workloads distributed across on-premises. And there are tons of workloads which we have in Office 365 and any of the Microsoft cloud investments. Hybrid brings them together, right? And hybrid experiences gives the user just the best of both of these worlds. And as you see, they happily live together ever after, right? Like what we see in... So what we would start off with is, let's try to look at what is this hybrid topology that we talk about. What's the hybrid infrastructure that is required even before we get to workload configurations? What you see on your screen right now is how a hybrid infrastructure would look like after you have configured it. So primarily you have Microsoft Office 365 Data Center and the SharePoint 2013 farm, which we are going to talk about for our hybrid workload today. What happens is there are certain key components which we see on the screen right now, of course, around the two workloads, which is BCS and search, which works, and it has to work in just two broad models. Now, what are those models? They are called outbound hybrid and inbound hybrid. Now, when we say outbound, this is always in context of your own network which exists today, your on-premises network. So outbound to your network and inbound to the network from Office 365. So the user experience in case of search would be when a user is logged into an on-premises SharePoint environment, they will be able to make a query, and the results would be returned from SharePoint Online as well as SharePoint On-Prem. The inbound case, this changes, where the user logs into SharePoint Online and gets to see results from SharePoint on-prem as well as SharePoint Online. Business connectivity services, you have your SQL Server database on your on-premises environment. And it was interesting. Somebody was talking to Neil and me and says, can I just go about and put my SQL Server down, up there in the internet? Of course you can do it. It's like, can I leave an ATM open and tell you still to go out and use your cards to draw the money, right? It's almost like that, right? You can't leave a SQL Server database just out there in the internet for everybody to kind of look at the data. So what happens interesting here is you keep your SQL Server database in your on-premises environment. You create an OData service so to be able to go out and interact with that data in the SQL Server. And then what you do is you configure hybrid, which means from SharePoint Online, you'd be able to go ahead and leverage that OData service to be able to talk to your SQL Server database, which is right on your network. So the key to this deployment is what I'm going to go ahead and talk about in the next couple of minutes. What exists before any of the hybrid, before any of the hybrid workloads comes into picture is exactly what I show you on the screen right now. You have Office 365, which you have subscribed to. You have your SharePoint on-premises. And what you do is, the first and foremost step is to ensure that you synchronize your user identities to Office 365 Azure AD. Because, again, that going by that example of SQL Server, you need to ensure you are getting your data just in the same secured manner, and only those people see the data who are entitled to see it. Supported ways of doing this, you could do directory synchronization. Neil is going to talk about more about the directory sync workload. You can do Azure Active Directory Sync. But what is key important is we do something called a user profile rehydration to ensure that the user identity which resides in your on-premises Active Directory is recognized as the same user with the right set of attributes before any data is returned. And the key player in going ahead and making this happen is user profile service application. So taking an example of search, somebody types in a keyword, and once they try to go ahead and retrieve any search results, along with the query which is being sent out to SharePoint Online, there is a set of claims which are sent across to SharePoint Online for that user. What happens after that is the set of claims are then matched against a set of attributes within the, that is there in the user profile service application for that user. And the response is, yes, this is a valid user with the same set of attributes which I have as the claims. And then the user identity is reconstructed. And of course, once the user identity is reconstructed or the profile is rehydrated, okay, then the user can be leveraged to go ahead and use all sorts of permissions and rendering and everything. So other than that, the key component which is required is setting up a trust with Azure Access Control Services. Primarily, the server-to-server authentication happens to ensure the requests are coming in from a valid on-prem domain. ACS, there was a question? Yes. Mm-hmm.
When you said if you're sending the query to the cloud, that assumes that you have different content sources and different indexes?
Yes.
On-premise is one on the cloud?
Yes. So in SharePoint 2013 model, it's a query model where we send a query to the remote index. If you were at our session in SharePoint 16, we are introducing a crawl model too. So as of now in 2013, it's just sending a query real time when the user types in the keyword. Okay, so coming back to ACS. ACS, or Azure Access Control Services, is the trust broker. Office 365 already has a trust with it. You establish a trust with it from your on-prem and ensure that it brokerages the connection and gives you the OAuth token for able to go ahead and proceed with the rest of the configurations. ADFS is an optional requirement. You can enhance your security and also go ahead and deploy single sign-on so that users would be able to seamlessly sign in with the set of credentials they have in their on-prem. Reverse proxy is required for all of the inbound cases, because what happens exactly is SharePoint Online is going to make a query back to SharePoint on-prem. And in order to do that, there needs to be a gatekeeper, or there needs to be somebody to be able to ensure that the requests are coming in from an authenticated source. And how it works out is a secure store has a certificate which it presents, and a copy of the certificate also is there in the reverse proxy. Post the certificate authentication happens, successful calls are being made. So that's how an infrastructure looks like. However, that's not always the case. In demos, everything works. When I go out and sit on trainings, the trainer shows everything is just so cool, okay? That's not how when we go back and kind of maintain things. So let's see what happens. Our guy comes in, jumps over, calls support. Support comes in, says, did you try turning off and turning it back on? Did that fix it? Well, let's take a look at how we fix it. I want to Neil to go ahead and take it from here.
Thanks, Manas. Okay, so drama aside, troubleshooting the infrastructure is interesting. So Manas has covered there the kind of directory synchronization pieces, ADFS, reverse proxy. So we need to think about how we're going to just validate those scenarios and validate some of the capabilities that we need to be able to support all of the hybrid workloads that we want to implement. And when it comes to troubleshooting, so directory synchronization is a key one. As Manas mentioned, this concept called user profile rehydration, we're going to talk a lot more about that at the end of the session because it actually has a particular impact on a key scenario. Directory synchronization is the key to making sure that works successfully. If directory synchronization fails, all bets are off. Your hybrid infrastructure is done. We're going to look at the trusts. How do we validate the trusts that we do? For those of you that in the room have gone through the process of configuring hybrid workloads, you've gone through that, deploying the registering new app principles, that whole messy PowerShell approach of configuring the whole thing up, which, unless you're familiar with it, is very easy to get wrong. So we're going to look a little bit how do we validate we've done all those pieces right. So give us a script that can validate what you've just done. And then we'll look at a little bit about services. So what services are we using? What do we need to use? What do we have to have deployed in the environment to make everything successful? So let's start with directory synchronization. So configuring directory synchronization is the key thing we need to do first. Very straightforward. In terms of actually going through the process, I'm not going to go through a demo of configuring this because it takes time to do all these steps. We're just going to walk through the process, and each one of these steps is critical to make sure that to ensure the success of the synchronization process. So within Office 365, we log into our admin center. We add our vanity domain or our on-premises domain where we're syncing our users from to the tenant. Very straightforward. You add it, click next, away you go. You then activate directory synchronization. And this is a straightforward button. You just click the button, wait for a bit of a time, and synchronization is active. The Office 365 tenancy is awaiting some input. It's ready to be synchronized. Then we have to go through this process of validating the domain. So I have to make sure that the domain I've added, I actually own. Okay, I can't go and add one of Matt's domains, for example, I couldn't think of anything else, to my tenant and start syncing his users. Okay, that's not going to be allowed. So we have to make sure that the incoming users are from a valid, trusted environment. And we do that by making sure that you own that domain. Right? Very straightforward. Add a text record or an MX record to your own domain registration. The Office 365 process goes and does a lookup against that record. If it finds it, it believes you, and away you go. We did recently, or 12 months or so ago, do an integration with GoDaddy as well. So if your domain's hosted by GoDaddy, they can do this for you. So you can just click Go with GoDaddy, you log in automatically, the records get automatically added for you, and validation happens usually seamlessly. Then we run the sync wizard. As Manas mentioned, there's a couple of different sync wizards out there these days. There's dir sync and AAD sync, and we're kind of standardizing on the newer ones. Very simply, though, the most simplest one is the one we've had around for quite a while, which is the dir sync engine. So you deploy it, you execute it, you go through a wizard process, which basically means provide your global admin credentials, provide local administration credentials to Active Directory, and eventually click go. Along with that is the option Manas mentioned previously about password synchronization. So we can choose to do password synchronization here and synchronize our password hashes with the cloud to allow a single user, same identity sign-on. After that, once we've done the synchronization, it's a very simple process of going and just checking that the users are actually appearing. Our users and groups are up in Office 365 in our tenant admin portal. And then the next step is obviously the important one, if you synchronize your users, they're effectively useless until you actually activate and license them so they can actually do some work. So I'm going to walk through a very quick demo just to show you that process of how we actually then go and validate directory synchronization. So if those of you that have gone through this process, as you step through it, the very last thing it says to you when you do the DirSync tool, it pops up a little dialog box and says, here's how you validate directory synchronization. So we're going to show you a very quick shortcut of how to do that now. So the first step, let me just make this a bit bigger, is because I'm lazy, I'm going to generate a new user with PowerShell, because I can't be bothered clicking around in I'll just prove the user doesn't exist though. So here's my user accounts. Okay, I have Miles Davis and Roger Waters and Sid Barrett. Okay, no Brian Lewis, right? We've got Bob Fox as well. He's not here, unfortunately. Okay, so I go into PowerShell. I'm just going to generate my new user. Let me just run this guy. I'm sick of doing scripts that have password embedded in them because everyone keeps stealing them and logging into my, I think this just auto-ran. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, I already exist, sorry. Did run the whole script. So I just go back into here and I refresh this guy. There we go. There's our Brian Lewis. Now, one thing my script didn't do, which is kind of important, is give him an email. So as Manus mentioned again, that user profile rehydration process, one of the attributes that we look for when we're looking to validate who the incoming user is and who the user in Office 365 is, and indeed the other way around for inbound hybrid scenarios, is SMTP address. Right? So it's one of the claims that we use to prove the identity. So I'm going to add him in here as well. Just making sure I got the right domain. Okay, so he's done. So the next step is directory synchronization. The directory synchronization engine is based off, for those of you that are SharePoint people, our good old favorite, the MIS sync engine, the FIM synchronization service. But it doesn't require crazy mad permissions and all kinds of local farm and local admin stuff. All you need is to be a member of the operators group to be able to actually use this tool. In order to do synchronization, once the tool's installed, very simple PowerShell command in the DirSync module is start-online coexistence sync. That will start off the process here, which will sync the user out to Office 365. And as long as there's nothing wrong with that user, everything should be successful. So we'll just give it a second. One user, won't take long. The newer tools have different commands. There's one of the new ones has a batch command you can use. And one of the other things to remember when you deploy this tool is it actually creates like a scheduled task on your DirSync server that runs by default every 3 hours. So if you're doing lots of domain changes, lots of updates, you might want to think about forcing that scheduled task or indeed running this PowerShell command. So we see it's exported successfully. If I go to my tenant, you can see here now we don't have Brian. If I refresh this, we hopefully, oh, there we go. Nothing like a real demo. We should have Brian in here. And I go to my users and active users. And there's Brian synchronized. So the only thing I would do now is go in and assign him a license. And a location. All of that we could have done with PowerShell. We didn't need to go and do that thing. It's all a separate demonstration. Okay, so in terms of validating that synchronization is working, we've pretty much done that. That's the process end to end, right? We've been able to move a user from on-premises into Office 365. We could go further now and provision him on the SharePoint site, log him in and all that kind of thing. That just takes a bit of time. You just have to believe me that that's going to work. If we go back to the slides, Manus. So proving that the sync engine's working is fine. But what if I'm in an environment that's got 150,000 users or 200,000 users out there? How do I know that every single one of those users is actually synced successfully? That's a pain of a task, right? To go in there and check every single one, maybe go in the MIS client and see how many reads, how many ads I did. It's a bit of a painful process. And when it goes wrong, you get a hideous message like this. So Microsoft Online will send you an email saying, from the message center saying, hey, DirSync broke. Great. And you get a message, a little bit of information down the bottom, why it broke. If I've got hundreds of users that have failed, I'm going to get loads of messages in here. And I have to go and look at every single one, validate, find the problem. In this case, it's a simple problem. we found a duplicate user with the same UPN. It won't sync if we find two users with the same UPN, which is a good thing, right? That protects the environment, protects you from making any crazy mistakes. Fairly recently, in fact, literally 2 weeks ago, we introduced some automation to help you with this process. And this automation is the DirSync troubleshooting tool. I'm going to stop walking over there. The DirSync tool is a new feature. If you have a problem with synchronization, either because synchronization was too long or we detected some problems with synchronization, you now get this new little button in the top corner here which literally says troubleshooting. It walks you through a wizard, very straightforward. You have two options when you run this thing, and I'm going to try and demo this for you. You have a quick scan and a full scan. Quick scan does a very quick check, just checks the users, checks the local permissions, checks that the DirSync configuration is correct. If you do a full scan, it even then starts to go deep into Active Directory, looking for broken organizational units, looking for invalid little scenarios inside Active Directory that will cause synchronization to break. It's a very deep, intensive scan. As we go through the process, very straightforward. You have to download an app. So it comes off our app platform. Those of you that might have seen the futures roadmap for hybrid scenarios, you saw the hybrid picker selector. This is kind of runs off the same platform. So it drops an app on your machine, goes through configuration, runs the process to do directory synchronization, troubleshooting, and then when it completes, you get a nice little warning message. So it's a key differentiator between, is my sync engine broken, or is my environment have some issues that prevent me from syncing everything I own, or everything I'm in control of. So I'm going to try and demo this to you now. Well, actually, this is that's a single scan report. You get a much deeper one as well. So as well as telling you what's wrong, it will also tell you what's right. Okay, and I'll show you these in a real demo, hopefully. So I'll go to my other environment. Here's my environment here. We've synced this environment successfully, right? So I don't have the little button now, but believe me, you will have the button if you have a problem. If we go into there, let me find the right one. This is where we start. So if I go through the process, I'm not going to go and execute this all the way to the end because I've got a problem. I need to re-authenticate. I'll just show you the reports. Let me zoom in. You can see the kind of scenarios we get here. This is a quick scan, right? So if we execute that, it does take time, so I can't really show you the whole process anyway. The quick scan gives you a nice, interesting look at what's going on, tells you the last time you synced, tells you whether there's any issues with your users, and that kind of thing. So it's a nice, interesting scenario. If something breaks, you can go and validate and see what's going on. The full scan, as I said already, is much more intensive. And we start to dig really deep into the forest domain settings, make sure the sync account isn't broken and doesn't have permission on any kind of organizational units or permission on any branches within the directory. Nice, straight. If you do have a problem when you log in, you can flick here between issues and results. If I click the issues and results, I'm going to get an authentication problem again, so I'm not going to embarrass myself with that one. However, an interesting scenario, an interesting thing that we have is if we fail to sync a user, we want to understand why and where all those users are. If you imagine a very large enterprise, your users could be spread out across all kinds of organizational units, across a very potentially hundreds of thousands of objects in a domain. So how do I find them, and how do I find what's wrong? This tool will tell me what's wrong. UPN problem, perhaps. Or I get a huge list in that email saying all these things. So there's another tool we can use. From the admin center, if I go into Manage Active Directory Synchronization, we see this tool here called ID Fix. So ID Fix is your friend for fixing this synchronization problem, actually for finding out where all those users are and what the actual problem is with those users. I have ID Fix already installed. If I download it, it comes down as a zip file, you extract it, it's just a desktop tool, you just execute it. So I'm going to execute it here. And I found a problem. Let me zoom in. So my good friend Kimo has a problem. Who can tell me what the problem is? Want a t-shirt? I was determined to give these away. I've given none away all week. So he has a problem, right? The reason I manually typed the email address before was just to demonstrate how you can make mistakes. It's very easy to make mistakes. Very simple. Kimo here has 2 @ in his email address. If we go and validate that in Active Directory, here he is. There's his address. and yet, success, it's broken. Okay, so what we can do with this tool is I can say, actually, you know what? I'm going to accept, no, not that one, correct. I'm going to accept the action to edit that. I'll accept it. It will go ahead. And if I rerun the query, it's failing. Don't do that to me. No, apply, sorry. So it's going to apply the fix. If I rerun the query, it's gone. Okay, so it fixed that one for me. If I just quickly check in AD again. Excuse me. You can see he's fixed it. So these are the tools that we're bringing out slowly but surely. I mentioned earlier that we know SPO keep fixing everything, right? They keep doing these things on us. We can't demonstrate these things anymore. So that's a nice, easy one, right? But believe me, it will find some very complex scenarios as well. That's just to show you the point. So in terms of validating those scenarios, what we want to do is just give you a little bit of a battle card to walk away with. What do I need to do? I've either got a sync problem on premises from synchronizing to the cloud, or I've got problems with my users. First thing to check the sync account. Okay? Password expiry is probably a huge cause of a number of support requests. If your global admin account expires, synchronization fails, and you end up with some horrible errors in directory synchronization. Use the MIS client. With SharePoint people, we told people to stay out of there, don't mess around in there. The MIS client in this case is a good friend. It's useful for troubleshooting and seeing what's going on. Validate the accounts with ID Fix. Make sure that all the accounts in your environment that you expect to sync are indeed syncing. And then follow the DirSync troubleshooting app if you want to see the actual environment, the actual synchronization application troubleshooter run. If you want the URL of that application, if you want to run it on a working environment just to see what you get, I can give you that later as well.
Thank you, Neil. So if you look back into when I was talking about the flow for how do you do hybrid, okay? Once users are synchronized and once you have ensured that users have made it to Office 365 Azure AD, the next thing which you have to focus on is to ensure is your server-to-server authentication is working. So quick recap around steps to configure server-to-server authentication. The first thing is you have to replace the STS certificate, the Security Token Service Signing Certificate for your on-premises SharePoint farm across all SharePoint servers in the farm. We have documented guidelines on TechNet and some references we are going to talk about later. Before you go ahead and proceed with doing anything in Azure AD, you need to install the Single Sign-On Assistant, which is a prerequisite for Azure Active Directory PowerShell. Once you do that, then comes the actual step of registering the on-premises STS as a service principal in Office 365. Here is something which we explicitly want to call out. We have seen people going ahead and having duplicate SPNs, like this SPN value should match the on-premises SharePoint URL, which is going to go ahead and send out the request for OAuth token. Okay, so sometimes we have seen for testing, people who do star.domain.com, and then they go back and do sharepoint.domain.com. Not something which you should do in a production environment. Hybrid won't work because it's duplicate. So star.domain.com takes care of everything which is within your on-premises environment. Add the SPN for the on-premises domain. Ensure that you have Office 365 registered as a high-trust app on your environment. And finally, you need to ensure that you set the authentication realm and deploy an Azure Access Control proxy in your on-premises, which is going to do this communication and ensure ACS can successfully take it as a source. So all the steps are through the set of PowerShell, which is in our TechNet guidelines, and you set this up. But as I was showing you some time back, there is another key player in ensuring that the users, when they send the request, they are recognized as the same user which is in on-premises. So ensure you validate your user profile service application in on-premises farm is up to date. It's started. It has gone ahead and done you've done a user profile import. You also need to ensure that they are synced properly with DirSync steps, which Neil was talking about, right? You have changed, for all the right reasons, you have changed the display name of a user or the UPN of a user. Display name won't matter for hybrid results, but UPN does, right? So, ensure after you have done a change, you have done a dir sync of it. And finally, how this all works is, as I said, we go ahead and do a match against one of these attributes which you see on the screen, which is either UPN, SID, SMTP, or SIP address. What we do for hybrid definitely is UPN. So if your on-premises UPN and online UPN doesn't match, and the scenarios are you have regional domain on-prem, like user at EU or user at us.corp.domain.com, and and you do not want that user should be synchronized with that, and you stamp your SMTP address, hybrid won't work unless you follow this set of steps. So you need to confirm, and here we are discussing around when hybrid is broken, right? So from a server-to-server authentication perspective, you need to confirm that the certificate thumbprint which you have used for your on-premises STS and online authentication which you have done, that's exactly the same, and there is no mismatch. You could use the get-sp security token service config as a commandlet to get that information. You need to confirm that your MS Online service principals are correctly populated with, there are no duplicates and there are no typos. We have seen that too, like, you type and there is a typo in the domain name that has been added as an SPN. So let's take a look at the quick demo. If you change that for me next. So what I have here is taking a quick look at the script. Remember, we were talking about certificates which are used to go ahead and establish the server-to-server trust. This certificate works with a self-signed, and you can use a self-signed certificate to replace the STS certificate on-prem and then convert to base 64 and ensure you have a trust, the server-to-server authentication set. So what I'm going to do right now is to ensure that the certificate thumbprints match. Here is a location which I have my certificates that I have used for my configuration. And, certificate password, of course, because I have the PFX one, right? You see this ID out here? This is the SharePoint Online app ID, which I'm going to register as in my on-prem environment. So SharePoint Online is registered as a high-trust app with which I'm communicating. Okay? I'm defining all of them in a variable. And then what I do is I'm going to validate the STS certificate and ensure that they match the thumbprint. The scripts are available, but I'm going to just execute it and show you this. So what I see here is the thumbprints match, which means I have ensured that this is the certificate which is in my STS, and this is the certificate which I have leveraged for going ahead and setting up the server-to-server authentication. The next thing is when you authenticate yourself to Office 365 as a global admin, so that you would be able to go ahead and query the service principal credential and ensure that you are not facing a problem because of the certificate has expired. And that's a common scenario which you have seen many a times. You generate the certificate, it has expired because you did it last year, and so you never know. So you authenticate. I'm already authenticated in interest of kind of time. And I do get-MSOL service principal credential. It's asking me for key values because this is our demo environment, and he tried setting up 15 times. I've done 25 times, so that makes it 40. But I'm going to pick one of them to show you what's that one. So it shows key ID, start date, end date, right? So you know that that's definitely not the issue. The final thing, which I would go ahead and do from an online perspective, is to see if I do have the correct service principal names. So the commandlet is get-MSOL service principal, and you try to get that information for the app principal ID for SharePoint Online. And I do have a wildcard, which means I'm covered for all my SharePoint on-premises boxes. There are some commandlets which we have to validate dir sync and when was it run, like what Neil showed you, right? If I do this and just go ahead and check this out, it shows dir sync is configured, the last sync was at this point of time, which means I do have all of the information correctly populated. The final one, which I want to show you, is user profile service application. There are hundreds of ways of validating this. Here is one quick way to just go ahead and, if you get the service application, get the UPA into an object and just check the status. It shows online. The final one, which is important from an on-prem perspective, is definitely the ACS proxy, which means if you do a get-sp service application proxy for ACS, is ACS online to be able to communicate with and ensure that you get the OAuth tokens. If all of these are in place, the issue definitely doesn't lie on the infrastructure scenario. Okay? And which is what? If I go back to the environment now, and I'm going to hand it over to Neil, we should be able to see hybrid search results.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Manas. So we've seen kind of the basic blocks of directory synchronization, validation. That validation step, by the way, for those of you that are building hybrid scripts or hybrid configuration scripts out, adding those validation steps that Manas went through there is really important. It gives you a nice way to validate that everything you've actually done is successful. And assuming everything works, this is the kind of thing we should see. At the top of our search results, if we configure the result sources and query rules up after we've built the hybrid infrastructure, we're not going to go into that in this session. We'll look a little bit into that from a troubleshooting perspective. You should start to see this kind of experience. So a separate set of results pinned to the top of a results coming from the on-premises or from the local search index indeed, and another set coming from a remote search index. Oh, to the gentleman's question before about the kind of unified index approach, this is the 2013 experience that we have today. What about if things go wrong? Do we get a warning? Do we get an empty block saying, hey, something's not working? No, we just get nothing. Right? We get totally no results back at all. No nice message to say, hey, we couldn't get there, but here's the results from your local environment. So we need to think about how we're going to go away and validate those things. And there's two very simple tools that you use to configure hybrid search workloads that make a great deal of sense to use to test hybrid regardless of the workload you're using. These are useful for BCS workloads as well, right? Because they test the underlying infrastructure. They test whether you are making those successful connections out to SharePoint Online, or indeed in the BCS scenario, making a successful connection inbound to the client service published on the reverse proxy. So the two things that we have the result source. Very straightforward. I'm going to walk you through a demo here. The result source that we configure in the case of a search result source, we're looking for where we're going to send the query to actually retrieve results back, and we're going to get results returned from. That has a feature on it which is called test source. And many of you probably know about this, but last time I ran this session, over 60%, 70% of the audience had never seen that button. They were like, where's that? Even some really experienced people have like, what? It does what? And it's really, really useful, because that's validating that the URL I'm trying to reach to is actually there. I can reach it and I can authenticate against it. But not only that, it accepts my authentication, it's also going to do something to process that request that's coming in. I'm hitting the right location. And then the second thing is the query builder. The query builder allows me to then start playing around a little bit with what I want to actually query against. So I choose my result source, and the query builder within the query rule, or the query rule itself defines when we're going to trigger the query. The query builder allows us to start playing around with what we're actually going to send in online, along with the keywords and any properties and the claims. And when we use that, we can see in this box here, and I'll show you this in a demo now, which should hopefully work. We'll see the results coming back from the remote location. So I'm going to walk you through a demo very quickly how we test these scenarios. If I go to my result source, so we get here by going through site settings, we log in, we click result sources, and we end up at the result sources section. Now bear in mind, you can only do this if you're an admin on the site. A site owner cannot do this. They can see them, but they can't administer them, they can't test them, okay? So I have my Office 365 search result here. If I edit this guy, I'll just show you what the settings are. So we can see here it's reaching out to an you just zoom that in for you. You can see that that's reaching out from an on-premises location out to Office 365, and it's going to submit the query out there. Very straightforward, nothing unusual about this configuration. If you've done hybrid search before, it's all the same. I go back and just look at test result source, or test source. We could get a succeeded, which in this case We do. So that's great. In the interest of troubleshooting, thank you. In the interest of troubleshooting, if you don't see succeeded, do it 3 times. Because once the web application's warm up on the other side and you don't get a timeout, there's a latency restriction here, right? You're sending something out over the WAN to a remote location. I'm going from here, I'm going from a VM infrastructure built in Azure and the East Coast of America to an Office 365 environment hosted in the west of Europe, in Dublin. So there's a bit of North Atlantic latency going on. So if it fails, just do it again a few times. Then call Manas. The other thing we can look at, again, in the site settings, we have this query rules option down here. That's a bit small. Let me make that bit bigger. We have the query rules down the bottom here. Is this option to go in and try and validate what we're doing. So I choose local SharePoint results. I'm not choosing the remote one now because I want this query to fire when I'm actually making a query against the local index. And it gives me this outbound hybrid setting here. And I'll just show you the configuration of that guy. So within here, I've basically got a very, very straightforward scenario. My context is I'm going to fire on all sources. I've got no conditions. So those of you that are familiar with hybrid know you can do all kinds of conditions about when I'm going to fire this query. I can prefix my search terms with like cloud, and it'll go and issue the query to the cloud. The interesting thing we're looking for is down here in the result block. So within the result block, we have this thing here called the query builder. And this is the thing we're really more interested in terms of making sure hybrid works. If this works, we should not see an error in this window. Or we should see no results. But that's not a bad thing, right? Because I haven't queried anything. I can do my testing, and this is why this tool is so useful. I can use this and do all kinds of query transformations and playing around in here. So I'm sending a query now against that remote result source. And if we look in here, Nelimo.com, SharePoint.com is remote. It's Office 365. This is working, right? So I've validated 2 scenarios. I've validated, can we reach the outside point? Am I, as a logged on user, actually able to authenticate and get results back? These 2 tools are super, excuse me. These 2 tools are super useful. If ever you're going to make a support call to CSS for a hybrid problem, make sure you've done this first, because this will tell you everything. And as you'll see in a few of the more slides and demos later on, this window will also give you the most meaningful error messages about when things go wrong, which they never do. And the output from this should be, fingers crossed, a successful outbound query. I'm going to be lazy. And there we go. So we've got both sides. Okay, nice and simple. If that fails, like I say, you wouldn't get the result block. So we're done. So what we're going to do now, we've just showed you the basic building blocks now. What we want to try and do is get into some complex, some less complex scenarios about support cases that have come into Microsoft when people had problems with hybrid, and how Manas and I went through, mostly Manas, went through the process of diagnosing the issues, working out what the problem was, remediating the problem, raising tickets to support, to SPO, raising tickets to the product group to say, hey, people are having problems with this, we need to help them. Like I say, a lot of these scenarios, we have to keep looking for new ones because they keep fixing them on us and we can't do them anymore. So we're going to keep it very simple. We're going to define the problem. What's the issue? What do users see or what do they not see? We're going to reproduce it for you and investigate. So we're going to do some reproduction. Now, bear in mind, some of the investigation steps took weeks. Right? So we can't show the whole process here. We're going to have to pre-see a lot of these steps. But we'll tell you how we did it. Then we're going to apply the fix. And then hopefully we'll have everything working for you. And we'll give you some references about maybe KB articles or specific scenarios, things to go and read and watch for if you see those same problems either in your own environments or with your customers' environments. So I'm going to hand back to Manas, and he's going to take us through the first ones.
Thank you, Neil. So the first scenario, as Neil mentioned, okay, this were the end result of all of them is no hybrid search results, or business connectivity services is not rendering the data. That's common. That doesn't change, right? If that would have changed, then it would have been awesome. Okay. But the first one is, this was a couple of months back when we did the same test result source. What we see is the 134 system.NET web exception, and the request was canceled, and it says the remote server returned a 404. Well, when we started talking to this gentleman, he comes and says, did they take down SPO 404? I'm like, no, I'm on it. Like, we don't take down SPO, like SharePoint Online like that. So what we do, we started off with our troubleshooting. Neil and me, we were discussing on this. It was quite interesting. We looked at the query builder. We checked ULS logs. Something which we saw here, and this is in, I'm going to show this in a demo right away after this. We saw that noderunner.exe, because this is remote call from the query processing component, right, which means it's getting from on-prem. And it says, SharePoint Foundation application authentication, retrieving the authentication realm for context, and it gives me that ID. And it says, then it tries to go out and give you this remote address. It gives me, from where it is trying to go out and do this call. And it says, oh, I'm getting a 404, Interesting. When we spoke to this gentleman, I was like, we are seeing a partition ID being sent out from your on-prem. Is your on-premises created in a partition mode? He goes, no, it's not a partition mode. Okay, and nothing against the specific interaction. What I'm trying to show is, at some times we do something because just for that was required for that specific point of time, but then we never recall it later. So we spend weeks to find out, or rather, quite an amount of time to find out, because I was clearly seeing it in the logs, right? What is in a partition mode? And the things were user profile service application. Was it in partition mode? Search service application. And indeed, what we saw was quite interesting. His search service application proxy was in a partition mode. So I was like, how was the search service application created? Oh, it was off the internet from a script. So let's look at that script. I did a control find, and it says new -sp search service application proxy -partition. Was that small hyphen partition? So let's take a look at the demo and see how things are on this environment. So what happens is result sources. If I go back and do a test source, same thing which Neil mentioned. Do a control. So if you see this, okay, it says the same exception which I'm talking about. I would try to go ahead and scroll down a bit, and it says here, the same error. Okay. So though I told you about the fix, okay, so what is it required to go ahead and get this fix? We do not support search service application in a partition mode for the existing version of hybrid queries. So we have documented it out in a KB article. End result is still the same. Okay, we need to actually go back, and this is what we did eventually to figure out. It shows us one. The fixes which we have recommended in the KB article, which when we worked on it, was you could actually go back, and if it is the search service application, you could flip-flop. There is a property called ignore tenantization. Or if it is a search service application proxy, you could just go about recreate it. Okay. So what I would do is, this is documented there in the article. I would say, just get this proxy, okay, and do this update. Okay. And if it is the search service application, you just get the search service application and set this ignore tenantization value. I've set back that proxy. So if I go back to my environment, and if I try to do a, refresh this, try to do a query now, that fixes it, right? But it's like now easy, we go back and say, so what is important out here, and that's the message which we wanted to, I don't want to take you through again, like looking for the search results. We were seeing it was failing, it shows succeeded. We will see search results. I'd want to rather focus on some more scenarios. So important message out here is we do not support on-premises search service application in a partition mode, and that is the reason why we were seeing a partition ID being passed across when we looked into the logs. So that's the KB article which you can look into. That's the script, and there are certain other recommendations from what do you see in the ULS logs. You could take a look into this and just fix it. So 404 is gone. Now let's look into another scenario. This is Same set of out-of-box tools, result source, query rule. Scenario is 401. What happens is possible causes, which you have documented. Important one was user permission in on-premises. The second one was quite interesting. Server clocks out of sync, right? What happens is when a query is being sent, the query would be sent and there would be a timestamp which is sent along with it, which means if when the pre-auth is happening with ACS, the server-to-server authentication, it needs to ensure that the server which is making the request from on-prem is indeed not one of those ones which you try to do any sort of malform attacks or spoofing or things like that. So it's the same standard protocol which we have for sync. The third one is again interesting, expired certificate. All of them would just go ahead and give you this same stack which says the remote server returned a 401. The ULS logs would point you to even a little bit more information which says which user it is, and that's specifically which we have for what we are getting on this. We have embedded an ULS logs for your reference if you want to go ahead and look into how does a real life scenario looks like in this case. However, for when you have 401, these are the set of things, or we call this the battle card, which you would want to look into from a troubleshooting scenario perspective. Confirm the user has access both on-prem and the root site collection in SharePoint Online. You could do this with get-msol user and ensure the user is synchronized. Check the server clock for all of the SharePoint boxes in your on-prem, and check for expired certificates like what I showed you when I did a get-msol service principal credential, and ensure they are not expired. We're going to look into another interesting scenario, which is 500. And again, it's the same set of tools out of box. Do a result source, query rule, you would see 500. Now, what was this 500? Here is what you would see as an error in the result source. This one is interesting. When we were discussing with the gentleman, he's like, all my global admins who has, who are like who can be on-prem, they have read access, but online, if they have global admin access, hybrid works. I'm like, we don't do any filtering in a query level, right, at that stage to ensure. All that we do is to ensure the user has some sort of access. So why only global admins? And I'll come to it. The interesting one is the result source, if it is not created or not pointing to the right URL. So when you create a result source, if you recall, Neil was showing us that you need to point it to the root site collection for your SharePoint Online. In this case, okay, the user had pointed it out to SharePoint Admin Center and not the root site collection. Interesting, finding still. And now you can correlate to what I said, because all global admins has access to Admin Center, right? But a reader may or may not, a reader account would of course not have access to global admins, level of access rather, right? So that's the reason why we were getting this error. This is what you would see in ULS logs, and this all are in your on-premises ULS logs, right? We're not even talking about the ULS logs from anything in SharePoint Online. The ULS evidence, it says permission mask failed, and looking for this, have this, which means I don't have access. And the fix was quite easy. Let me, Neil, if you take me back here. The fix was, if I do this, if I test source, it clearly tells me the 500 error message. If you go back to your ULS logs, you would see that this is, I don't know if it is viewable from there, but it's the remote server returned 500 internal server error message.
Can't see it.
Can't see? Okay. Okay, so this is the error message which would throw up in the ULS. And again, the fix is, as I mentioned, one second, I got into this one environment, yes. So again, what happened is, if I search for within that user, okay, from this user context, no search results. If I go to manage result sources, this is what I was showing you. If I edit this, I would see that I'm pointing to the admin center, and This user, because it is not a global admin, doesn't have access to the admin center. I change this, click on save, and if I go back and do a test result source, okay.
Do it again.
I should have followed your caution about 3 times, but hopefully second time it works. Did I do a typo?
You're good.
Okay. So if I go back and just refresh the page. Was there a dot? No.
There we go.
It's the third time.
Told you, 3 times.
I should have listened to you. Sorry. So third time it does it. So it's just that sending out. If you take a fiddler trace, you'll be able to go ahead and see that. So if I now go back to the user, of course I will go ahead and see such results, which I would just refresh this page, and he sees such results, right? So pretty much like, if you take me back to the slide. So that's what you want to look into. Again, confirm that the user has access to the site. You have correctly gone ahead and pointed to the root site collection. If everyone is a global admin in your environment, you could still point to, admin center. That's not an issue. But with that, let me go ahead and hand over to Neil to go ahead and look into a couple of other scenarios.
Thanks, Manas. So those scenarios that Manas covered there, that pointing the URL to the admin center is surprisingly common. Yes. And it's amazing that that case ever reaches us, right? You think the on-premises support people would catch those. Well, they do. We get them all the time. We also get 401s popping up, which are not always straightforward, simply access denied, or, hey, I haven't permissioned you on the site. And things can happen in some interesting ways. This is a simple, very straightforward scenario one. We mentioned another 401 earlier. We can generate 401s due to certificate failures. We can generate 401s due to you don't have permission on the site. The interesting one Manas was pointing out to there, if you think about that 500 error, that 500 error message will also appear if you point to the right place, but the user doesn't have permission. And it's an interesting kind of paradigm, if you like, that when you're coming from online into on-premises and you don't have permission, we give you a 401. Straightforward. We all expect that. We see that in our ULS logs. We see that in our IS logs. If you go from on-premises to online and you don't have permission, you get a 500. So it's a very different response for exactly the same problem when it comes down to it. There was another issue back in April of 2014. We released the April CU for SharePoint on-premises. And people installed it, and every single one of our hybrid customers raised a support ticket because we broke hybrid, right? And we broke it in a kind of interesting way. We removed one of the claims mappings. So we introduced a new feature, actually, which is to do with alternate access mappings for supporting hybrid scenarios and audience capabilities. That feature, as part of the, I'm going to use the horrible word regression now, because we've all heard that one, right? So that feature, as part of that implementation, actually removes something that you need. So we talked earlier about user profile rehydration and identifying the identity or identifying the incoming user because of their claims and the information that gets passed in with the query. And the thing we broke was this. The user profile identity claim mapper. We removed one of the mappings in the claims mapping engine, if you like, or the claims rules. And that caused, we couldn't then identify who the incoming user was, so you immediately got a 401 access denied. Again, another difficult one to troubleshoot. It wasn't a problem with the implementation that the customer had done. Their configuration was correct. We had to go digging in and find out where the problem actually was. This issue is still here today. I was going to demo this, but then I realized I hadn't patched my environment past April CU, so I couldn't demo it for you. But the problem still exists today. So if you're building newer versions of SharePoint 2013 today, patched right the way up to date, you can run into this issue even now. I think the fix is imminent, but yes. Or maybe it's in a more recent fix, but this is how you fix it. Basically, you just add the claims mapping back. So it's well documented. It's one to certainly be aware of. Make sure you've got this in your hybrid toolkit. Because if you start seeing odd 401s, this is almost certainly the problem. And you can simply do a get SP authentication pipeline claims mapping rules. You can iterate through them. You can enumerate them, and you'll see if it's missing. There's one called org ID, which is over here. The org ID rule will be missing. You'll just have one, which is the Windows mapping rule. So we've seen Manasys 401. This is a different 401. Okay, very straightforward. Validate first of all. You get a 401. The first thing any admin worth his salt does, or support engineer versus salt does, is go and check for permissions. Right? In this case, the user had all the permissions they need. So it's an interesting one. And then check the claims mapping. So again, keep this ready, keep it available, make sure you check it. Perhaps it's another one to add to that hybrid validation script that we showed you earlier. Validate this scenario as well. So another one that we see is a 403, and this is a kind of a strange one. So throughout the process of configuring hybrid, there's a number of things you need to do involving certificate management. Adding certificates to stores, copying certificates to reverse proxies, putting certificates in the secure store in online for inbound scenarios. It is possible, and we will not validate that you use the correct certificate in the right places. Okay, so if you put the wrong certificate in your reverse proxy, and then put a certificate in your reverse proxy and a different certificate in the secure store, we don't care. We're not going to validate. We don't know what you actually want to use them for. Okay, and this is the result of that. So you start to see 403 errors popping up all over the place. And certificate mismatch kind of shows it up in all kinds of different areas. It depends where you make that, where you perform that implementation, and which particular certificates you mismatch effectively. So mismatching the SSL cert, you'll start to see these trust problems, establishing secure channel. And then the other scenario is, if I use a certificate that SharePoint Online doesn't trust. So we obviously Microsoft have a published list of trusted certificate authorities that we consider to be our root trusted domains. There was a new one added fairly recently, right? Yes. The new one was added because people were getting certificates issued by this globally trusted certificate issuer that we didn't trust. So as a result of that, they were uploading these certs. Perhaps they were cheaper than everyone else's, so they were using them a lot. And we found that all of a sudden Office 365 was not able to validate that certificate. And if we can't validate your certs, we're not going to try and use them for anything. Okay, we just fail straight away. So that's where you get the 403. So just a quick tool, simple way to test the certificate itself. For testing for expired or indeed not trusted, you use CertUtil. It's an old tool. It's been around for a long time. There's other mechanisms for doing it. This is kind of a tried and trusted one for putting your Batman utility belt to keep it around. Very simple test. Do a verify on the certificate. It will tell you, is the certificate trusted? As in, I mean, it will obviously only test it only tell you from where you are trusting it. So do we trust it based on the trusted issuers that are on my machine or my server? But it will also tell you things like whether the certificate is expired, when it's expired, and give you a whole realm of information about the actual certificate itself. Again, another check to do before you call support, right? Just save you some time, save you some support hours. The key thing, as I've already mentioned, update or validate or replace the certificate if required. If you're a Microsoft person, it's easy. We get free certs off DigiCert. If you're not, then you're going to go and buy some. Okay. And then we come on to another interesting scenario. This is the concept of UPN. So Manus mentioned earlier this concept of user profile rehydration, and where you have scenarios where users, if you take me for example, at Microsoft, right, my full UPN at Microsoft is neilh@europe.corp.microsoft.com. When I log into Office 365, I don't want to type all that thing out to be able to log in. I want to just use my email address, right, which is neilh@microsoft.com. Keeps things simple for me, makes things painful for Office 365. And we'll come and talk on that in a few minutes. So keeping it very simple, the scenario here was we had a case, in fact, we had a number of cases, where a customer called in that says, hey, you know what? We've remapped our identities. We've remapped our logins for our users to email address instead of UPN. Because UPN is too long, it's painful, like I just said with my scenario. They want to keep it nice and simple, contoso.com. So what they did was they mapped their SMTP address in on-premises to the value of the UPN that's passed to Office 365. Can they log in? Absolutely. No problem at all. It works. Right? You'd expect it to work. That's the UPN. That's what we're going to log in as. The problem is it will blow the hell out of your hybrid configurations. Right? Hybrid will not work if you go ahead and do this. So you need to be very careful. And the reason why, if we keep it very simple, when we're thinking about user profile rehydration, I'm going to go through the process here simply and then tell you why that scenario actually breaks. If I'm my end user sat over here, this is my Bob Fox, and I issue my on-premises query, through my on-premises infrastructure, and it's going outbound now to Office 365. We hit that endpoint, that client service endpoint in Office 365, the end of my URL. The incoming query is then fractured into fundamentally two things. There's the query itself, which consists of keywords and properties. There's the claims. So the claims are, who am I as a user? How do I identify who I am? When the query processor receives the keyword and the property, it wants to know who the user is. So it effectively issues a challenge to say, who are you? Well, this is kind of a parallel process, but in a simple terms. Those claims are then validated against the user profile service application. And as we go through, we validate the UPN in the user profile service application against those claims. So we check the UID, SID. We check the SIP, okay? We check the SMTP value, and we check the UPN. UPN is successful, so we pass our identity over. These guys map their SMTP address to that UPN, right? So at this point, they're logged in. Everything's good, right, from a login perspective. In terms of a search perspective, though, this now fails. Let me just go through this and I'll tell you why it fails. The reason why it fails is because when I issue claims from my on-premises, when I'm logged in as my user and I issue my query, the claims that go from within the context of that query are not the claims from the on-premises UPA, right? Some of them are, but the key one that matters is UPN. The UPN is retrieved from the user context of the logged on user. And my user context is always going to be europe.corp.microsoft.com. So if I then go and map my Microsoft.com email address up into Office 365, when we try and make that comparison, I don't have a UPN in Office 365 that matches the UPN I've logged in with down in my on-premises environment. So we get this scenario where things start to break. When people are trying to map that up to make it makes it easier for you to log in, but it makes it impossible for us to do a match of your UPN from your on-premises login against the UPN we have in Office 365. So basically you get access denied. And that's another one of these 401 scenarios because we can't identify who you are. The people that did the custom config, very straightforward. And this is kind of identifying these two things here. So my Office 365 login is neilh@contoso.com. My AD login to my laptop is neilh@europe.contoso.com. So it's going to fail. We can't match the two together. Very, very straightforward. The fix for this, or the current workaround for this, is to map your SMT proxy, your mail proxy addresses. So not the straightforward SMTP address. You're adding the URL you want to use, or sorry, not URL, sorry, the UPN you want to use for login, you add to, you map them to your SMTP proxy addresses via the DERSync process. So you're adding additional values into that field in Office 365, which means we can then make that comparison. And when we make that SMTP comparison, we get success. Okay, that's fine. There was another option, which was to map them to the SIP address. Right? That's also fine, because we test that one as well. But it breaks link online, so you're kind of in an awkward situation. What we do when we're performing the query at this point is all the additional claims for the proxy and SMTP addresses are added to that query so we can match them up in online, and hybrid is successful. But it doesn't work in all cases. It's not the ideal scenario. So we've come up with this plan or this proposal to fix this situation. And the proposal is we're going to add a new identifier in Office 365, this concept of the MS Online on-premises security identifier, which is just the SID. So as well as now mapping against SMTP and SIP and UPN, we're going to do something even more sensible and take the SID, which should be this globally unique identifier for your user, and use that instead. And this process now is enabling a lot more for hybrid scenarios with SharePoint 16, with new versions of Office 365. So it's going to be the new way of working in terms of making that work. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Manas to cover the BCS scenarios.
Thank you. And that's the last scenario we're going to talk about today. We have the infrastructure in place. We ensured that search is working, which means the same story which I told you in the beginning, where your SQL Server is in on-prem and you're trying to go out and make a query from SharePoint Online, just should work fine. However, that's not always the case. You're trying to go out and import an BDCM file, or rather the ECT file, okay, to SharePoint Online. Within BCS, you get this error message, which says connection setting with ID, SPO, BCS is required, and that was a classic case which we were dealing with some time back, I think last week or week before. And it gives you a correlation ID. Now, this is importing to SharePoint Online kind of makes the life of any end user a little tough, which is why I have my job, and I need that correlation ID to be able to go out and pull the ULS logs from SharePoint Online. This is the
Try again.
Okay. This is the end user experience, which means end user will just try to browse to that external list and say, sorry, something went wrong. That's another important correlation ID, which you can kind of keep handy when we talk in terms of support. And then, in interest of time, what I would do is I'll show you this in a demo and kind of just quickly take you through that. So here is a scenario. I'm logged into my SharePoint Online environment. I'm clicking on Manage BDC Model and External Content Types. And I'm trying to import I'll be trying to go ahead and import a file, which is which should be my definition file from the environment, okay? Give me a minute, guys. I think I'll have to just re-authenticate again and then come back to this page. So if I click here, it should allow me to...
Did you break it?
It's Office 365. So, yeah, okay.
Did you break it?
No. Okay. So I'll click on Browse, and I'll try to go ahead and get my file imported here. Click on Import, and I see the error. What we figured out was when I got that correlation ID, okay, if you look at this importing stage, there are certain things which it validates at certain stage of this import. That's the exact error which we see. So I go back to my on-premises environment, and the first thing I should look for is, it's talking about a secure store ID. Does that even exist? It exists, right? So there is something definitely wrong somewhere else, and of course it's that, couple of hours of troubleshooting. I then look back at the file, okay, and what I saw is, when I'm trying to go ahead and look into that, the setting specified here, it, of course, will not find it. It says SPO-BCS, where in my on-prem was SPBCS, okay? Which means you need to ensure that you indeed have the correct names out here. Save that file and try and import again. Again, as I said, easy when we fix it, but that's exactly what my correlation ID helped me out to kind of go ahead and look into. I'll click on Import, click on Browse, and try the import again, and allow it to go. In the meantime, when this import is going on, I'm going to take you back to my slide. It, of course, is on 3%. We'll come back to the screen and show you just one scenario around BCS import, which is super important. When you are doing business connectivity services, remember, in your SharePoint on-prem web.config, you need to have this mapping out there. What does this mapping say? It says Microsoft Office Secure Store Service, and this is the mapping between 16 and 15 references. SharePoint Online is 16. You need to define the mapping for your on-premises existing SharePoint 2013 environment, which is definitely key. Else, even if you import the file successfully, you will not be able to go ahead and get to any of the sources. So if Neil turns back to the demo environment, this time it imported without that SPBCS error. And if I go back to my business connectivity services, here is an external list. It should be able to kind of render back the data properly. And you guys would believe me on that because it's not throwing that error anymore. Yeah, there's the data. I'll hand it over to Neil for the summary.
Okay, thanks. So as we said already, some of those scenarios are a little bit contrived. We had to try and build something based off what our customers have seen. So Manas's point, a little bit of a BCS summary, a bit of a battle card, things to check if you have BCS problems with customers. The ones we see are really weird, and you always stare at them forever thinking, where's the problem? And because BCS involves model files and ECT files and web.config modifications, it is a more complex scenario than search. Those result source test is useful for testing even this to make sure your authentication channels are all set properly for that as well. So just some quick summary there in terms of check your connection settings, validate the model name, which is the problem Manas had. Also watch for spaces in the model name. I kid you not, a principal consultant, a senior escalation engineer, and a program manager spent 10 days looking for a space in a model file, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that turned out to be the problem. That is no exaggeration. Internet-facing URL. With SharePoint, when we're doing search, we just go to the root of our web application in SPO or online. With BCS, you have to manually add this VTI bin client service to the end. It doesn't do it for you. So it's, again, different to search. And then the other thing, as I mentioned with the result source, make sure you validate that core hybrid infrastructure, again, before you do anything else. So a bit summary. We've covered infrastructure at a glance. We've covered the troubleshooting hybrid scenarios very, very straightforwardly. Some of the coolest ones we can't show you because they've fixed them. Result source and query builder are your friend, absolutely your friend. And then we've covered a few common and uncommon scenarios. Manas has got a fabulous blog series on hybrid troubleshooting configuration. We're adding to it all the time as we pull up with these new scenarios. I recommend, above the TechNet articles, coming from a Microsoft person, Manas's blog is a place to go for knowing how to configure hybrid configurations. Absolutely 100%. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.